Hello, Chatsworth. This is Mike Amori, one of the chess teachers at school. Really looking forward to next week. You're not going to believe how many kids have signed up for chess during lunchtime. It's amazing. We had to add extra classes to fit everybody. Anyway, I want you to take a look at a game that was played by one of my students. His name is Ben. And Ben played in Nashville, Tennessee last month in December. And he was playing a boy from Texas. Ben has black here. And I want to take you through the game because it's a really good warm-up for what's coming next week. In your class, you're going to get a chance to play, obviously. So when you do, and you're the one that's in charge of putting the pieces out, take some advice from the kids that you're going to see play today. Let's look at the opening moves, and I'll give you a better idea what I'm talking about. So the game begins with e4, e5. Both players put their e-pawns in the middle of the board. And it's important to use your center pawns because each one of them, you'll notice, will let out one of the bishops, which can come out diagonally. Why do we want to bring the bishops out? Well, once they come out along with the knights, and knights and bishops are called minor pieces. You'll get all of this next week again. Once those minor pieces come out, the king can castle. Hopefully you remember what that means. And then once those players are out and the king is castled, each team can start attacking the other side. It gets really exciting. So white brought their knight out, and you'll see that the knight is attacking the pawn here on e5. Ben doesn't want to give that away, so he brought his knight out to protect it. White brought a bishop to c4, and Ben played bishop to c5. These games are played very often, or this opening rather, where you'll see the two knights in this position, the bishops come out like this, and from here, the game can turn very, very quickly. So let's finish up. White castled, and if you forgot how to castle, it's the only time in the game where the king gets to go 2 boxes. Normally, he can only move 1. So you have to wait until there's nothing between the king and one of the rooks. And you can actually move your king 2 squares in the direction of one of the rooks, and the rook just simply jumps over his head. It's also the only time the rook can jump, and you can move 2 pieces at the same time. You'll also notice that after you castle, it's very, very hard to get to the white king because he's really well protected. Okay, Ben's turn. I'll give you a hint. See this bishop down here on c8? He wants to bring it into the game. Problem is it can't move because the bishop is not allowed to jump. So which pawn did he move? Well, you could move either one, but Ben decided to use one of the center pawns. So he moved his pawn to d6. White brought the second knight into the game, and here Ben played a really cool move. He played bishop to g4. And this is the first tactical idea. And remember, a tactic in chess is simply a trick. And this one is called a pin. And a pin is basically, let me turn some lights on for you. Do you see that arrow? See how the bishop is attacking the knight here? Well, what would happen if this knight suddenly moved somewhere? Do you see what the bishop could take? Yeah, the queen up at the top of the board. So by putting the bishop on this square, Ben is pinning this knight to the queen. If it moves, you'll lose the queen. Now, don't forget, you are allowed to move the knight, but if you do, you'd end up losing your queen. Okay, so white didn't like that. So what he did is he played pawn h3, and we say in the chess world that this pawn is asking the bishop a question. Now, did Ben's opponent talk to him during the game? No, these kids were not allowed to talk. But the pawn is basically telling the bishop, hey, look, man, if you sit there, I'm going to take you, and you're going to lose a 3-point piece for nothing. You guys remember the points? Bishops and knights are worth 3 pawns. A rook, 5. The queen, 9. What about the king? Well, if you could take the king, he'd be worth a lot, but you're not allowed to take him. You have to trap him. And once you do, the game is over. So I guess the king is priceless. Okay, so Ben, in this position, decided to make a fair trade. He doesn't want to lose his bishop for nothing, so he took the boy's knight. Now, if you look at the board, white has 2 different ways to take. He could take the bishop with the g pawn, but I think by doing that, white was afraid to open up this line. Can you see my mouse toggling here? And if the G line opens, it might be possible for a piece to get in there and bother the king. Turns out that happens later in the game. So let's go back. Here, white decided to take back with the queen. And in this position, Ben made a terrible mistake. He really should have lost the game in only 7 moves. The mistake Ben made was he put his knight on d4. And by doing it, it attacks the queen and it attacks the c-pawn, which is not protected. So it looks on the surface that Ben made a really good move. Can you guys see what he did wrong? You can pause the video if you want. Why was that such a mistake? Well, I'll put a highlight on for you. You see the bishop on c4 pointing at this pawn? Well, so is the queen, and Ben completely missed that. But he was lucky that day because his opponent missed it too. All white had to do was take that pawn with the queen, and in just the 8th move of the game, it's checkmate. Can you imagine? Yes, you cannot take that queen, because if you take her, you'll be in check with the bishop up there. There's no escape. The game is over. But fortunately for Ben, his opponent missed it and thought the only thing to do was to protect this pawn up here on c2, so he took his queen and backed all the way up. Whew, he got really lucky. Okay, he played knight f6, and it's funny, even after the queen moved, he admitted to me in the team room he never saw that trade. So he got real lucky. After knight f6, white wants to bring this bishop into the game. And by the way, how do I know what these kids wanted to do? Well, Ben took notes. He had to write the moves down. So we went over the game, and all he had to do was leave me a copy so I could make you guys this video. All right, how do you get the bishop in the game? Pawn to d3. And now I like Ben's move a lot. He played queen d7. And this is kind of interesting because if you look at the black king down here now, black can castle to the right or to the left. So it's a very flexible move. He's going to wait to see what happens depending on what side of the board to castle. Okay, white's turn. Bishop to g5, attacking the knight. And here Ben decided to castle on the queen side of the board. And by doing that, the kings now live on opposite sides. The black king is on the queen side of the board, and the king here is on the king side. And let me explain that to you, because you're going to hear both of us at chat use those expressions or those terms. Doesn't the black queen start here? Yes, she does. And because she starts here, everything on this side of the board is considered the queen side. This king starts here, correct? Well, everything on this side is the king side of the board. So which way did he castle? King side. This king, queen side. Okay, after castling, Ben's opponent took the knight. Ben took back, and at first glance, it seemed that that was good for white because he kind of broke up these pawns, but I think white forgot he actually opened up this line. Remember we talked about that before? For the black rooks. Okay, but he had a good idea why he did this. He now jumps his knight into this square, attacking this undefended pawn. But what Ben did was very clever. He moved his rook, the H rook here, to g8, and he lined it up with the king. Let me turn on the lights again. You see that arrow? Well, by lining it up with the king, it gives him a chance to play a little trick. White took the pawn, and here Ben takes a pawn with his queen that looks like a mistake. He actually took the pawn up here on h3. You guys see that? Now you may ask, that's a terrible move. Why doesn't the white pawn just take the queen? Do you see why the pawn cannot take? Yeah, it would be illegal because the rook would be checking the king. So that was very clever. But Ben did lose a rook for a knight. But good for him, he has 2 rooks. So the second rook came over, and this rook is putting a lot of pressure on the pawn. If you were to count the points here, you might see that white has more power on the board, but that's not really the most important thing in chess. What's more important is the fact that these black pieces are really well placed. Okay, white has a problem. This, my friends, is checkmate. If the queen takes that pawn, it's all over. Well, what to do about that? In the game, Ben's opponent pushed the pawn one square forward. And by doing that, he allowed a really beautiful trick. I want you to imagine that this knight here on d4, it wasn't there. Just not on the board at all. If it's not there, do you see how this bishop would be pointing at this pawn here? If this pawn were on the same diagonal as this bishop and it was open, it would not be allowed to move. Do you guys see why? It would be check. I know it may sound complicated, but I know you can do this. So what does Ben do? He gets rid of the knight, but he does it in a way that stops white from doing anything about the checkmate. Now, what to do with the knight? He played check. And he did it on this square, not this one. Because if he would have checked here, the white queen could have taken the knight and come out to protect her king. But what Ben did by putting the knight here, you see that diagonal I opened for you? It's check. The only way to get out of check is the queen had to take. That's the only way white gets out. And now, checkmate in one move. Can you find it? Pause the video if you have to. Look at this. Rook takes pawn. That's actually checkmate. You might think the pawn can take, but don't forget, there's a bishop here. That would be illegal. The queen cuts off these squares. The rook gives the checkmate. Really beautiful game. But it just goes to show you, don't give up, because Ben made a really bad mistake. His opponent didn't see it, and he was actually able to win the game. Okay, I hope this helps you warm up. Really looking forward to seeing you next week. Okay, Chat Chess, take care.